Let's get one thing straight. Avoidants don't disappear because they don't care. They disappear because they do, and they don't know how to handle it. Avoidantly attached individuals often get misunderstood as cold, uncaring, or emotionally unavailable by nature, but the truth is far more nuanced. When an avoidant withdraws from a relationship, especially at a moment when things seem to be deepening, it's rarely because they've stopped caring. In fact, quite the opposite is often true. The withdrawal is a defense mechanism, a self-preservation tactic to regulate internal emotional overwhelm that they don't yet have the tools to navigate safely. Avoidants typically grow up in environments where emotional needs were not consistently met or where vulnerability was punished or ignored. Over time, they learn to equate closeness with discomfort, dependence with danger, and emotional exposure with loss of control. So as adults, when they begin to form real emotional bonds, those old wounds resurface. Even if the relationship feels healthy, the feelings of connection, while often longed for, also trigger fear. And because they haven't developed the same emotional language or coping skills as someone with secure attachment, their nervous system defaults to one thing: distance. Pulling away isn't always a calculated decision. It's often automatic, even unconscious. The more intense the connection, the more their system tries to regulate the perceived emotional threat by shutting down or retreating. That's why avoidance can be warm, affectionate, and deeply engaged one moment and distant, aloof, or even cold the next. It's not a reflection of your earth. It's a reflection of their inner conflict. They care, but they don't feel safe with what caring demands: vulnerability, communication, emotional reciprocity. This is also why many avoidants return after a period of silence. When the emotional pressure dissipates, when the other person backs off or gives space, the avoidance nervous system calms down. With emotional intensity lowered, they're able to reflect, miss the connection, and sometimes feel guilt or longing. But at the time of withdrawal, their primary goal isn't hurting or abandoning the other person. It's surviving what feels like an internal emotional overload. If you're on the receiving end of this pattern, it's crucial not to internalize their retreat as rejection. It's emotional self-regulation masked as distance. This doesn't excuse poor communication or emotional avoidance, but it does provide context. Understanding that their withdrawal stems from fear, not apathy, can help you avoid the trap of chasing, fixing, or blaming yourself. The key to navigating this dynamic is self-awareness and boundaries. You can care for someone who struggles with intimacy, but you also have to care for yourself. That means not abandoning your own emotional needs just to maintain the connection. By remaining calm, grounded, and consistent, not reactive, you create the kind of emotional environment that eventually feels safer for the avoidant to step into. In short, avoidants withdraw not because they don't feel, but because they feel too much and they don't yet know how to hold it. For individuals with an avoidant attachment style, silence isn't just a reaction, it's a refuge. When emotional intimacy begins to deepen, avoidants often feel cornered by the intensity of connection. The closeness that others find comforting can feel intrusive or suffocating to them. So instead of leaning in, they pull back. And in that retreat, silence becomes their way of managing the perceived threat. It's not just avoidance, it's their way of reclaiming a sense of emotional control. Avoidants grow up learning that vulnerability is risky. Perhaps they were shamed for their emotions, neglected when they needed comfort, or forced to be self-reliant too early. Over time, they internalize a message: I'm safer when I don't depend on others. This early blueprint doesn't just disappear in adulthood, it drives how they show up in relationships. So when conflict arises or intimacy grows, their nervous system doesn't interpret that as it interprets it as danger. Silence then becomes their shield. By withdrawing, avoidants believe they're protecting themselves from being overwhelmed, judged, or losing their autonomy. In silence, they don't have to explain, open up, or be accountable for their feelings. They don't have to risk being misunderstood or emotionally exposed. It gives them time, space, and what feels like peace. But here's the key. It's a false sense of safety. Because while silence may reduce the short-term stress of emotional confrontation, it doesn't actually resolve the deeper emotional conflict. Instead, silence often creates distance, confusion, and damage in the relationship. The partner on the receiving end feels abandoned, dismissed, or unsure of where they stand. They may begin to doubt themselves or feel like they're the problem. Meanwhile, the avoidant tells themselves they're calming down or just need space, when in reality, they're pushing down the very feelings that need to be acknowledged. And the illusion of control, that's another trap. Silence may allow avoidants to avoid immediate discomfort, but it also keeps them disconnected from intimacy, growth, and healing. It reinforces the belief that emotions must be managed alone rather than shared. It keeps them emotionally isolated even in the presence of someone who cares. Avoidants often return after periods of silence, thinking everything can go back to normal. But silence isn't neutral. It speaks volumes. It tells the other person, when things get hard, I disappear. And over time, that erodes trust and emotional safety for both people. What avoidants truly need isn't more silence. It's emotional regulation skills that don't rely on withdrawal. They need to learn that staying present doesn't mean losing control. It means building a new kind of control, one rooted in communication, boundaries, and emotional maturity. So yes, silence gives them temporary relief, but it's not real safety. Real safety comes from facing the discomfort, not fleeing it. From learning that connection doesn't have to cost autonomy, and that true control is built through engagement, not escape. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, emotional suppression is second nature. They've spent much of their lives pushing down feelings, particularly vulnerability, need, and longing, because they were taught, either directly or indirectly, that those emotions are unsafe. So when they form a bond with someone who triggers those deeper feelings, the immediate instinct is to retreat, to avoid the discomfort of emotional exposure. But here's the paradox. While they use distance to avoid those feelings, your absence, especially when it's firm and consistent, does the very thing they were trying to escape. It forces them to feel. When you're present, the avoidant can rely on the illusion of control. They know you'll reach out. They know you'll close the gap. They know they can disappear and still be emotionally held by your efforts. But when you go quiet, when you stop over-pomponing and hold your boundary instead of chasing, that's when something unexpected happens. The emotional reality they've been suppressing starts rising to the surface. Your absence removes the distraction of your presence. There's no conversation to ignore, no text to deflect, no warmth to withdraw from. And in that silence, what they're left with is themselves and everything they've been avoiding. The connection they tried to mute now becomes louder in their mind. The care, the comfort, the attention they took for granted, it starts to haunt them. And the emotions they told themselves they didn't feel, they suddenly become unavoidable. Avoidants don't process emotions in real time. They delay, defer, and detach. But that backlog doesn't disappear. It just builds. And when you step out of the picture, their coping mechanism, distance, loses its effectiveness. There's no longer anything to run from, but their own inner world. That's when the suppressed feelings begin to emerge. Grief, regret, fear of loss, longing, even love. But they don't always know how to name these feelings. Instead, it might come out as anxiety, restlessness, irritability, or intrusive thoughts about you. That's because they never learned how to sit with their emotions, let alone express them. This is why your absence can be more powerful than your presence, because it creates emotional contrast. It removes the comfort cushion and forces the avoidant to confront what they feel when you're no longer around to absorb their avoidance. And often, it's only in your silence that they begin to reflect, not just on you, but on their own patterns. This doesn't mean they'll suddenly come back with clarity and commitment, but it does mean your absence triggered the emotional awareness that their coping mechanisms worked hard to avoid. And that awareness, that's the crack where growth begins, if they're willing. So never underestimate the power of pulling back. Not to manipulate, not to play games, but because In your absence, you create the one thing an avoidant needs to evolve, the space to finally feel what they've been avoiding all along. In relationships involving someone with an avoidant attachment style, it can feel like the connection vanishes overnight. One day they're engaged, affectionate, or at least present, and then suddenly they pull away, go silent, or become emotionally distant. It's easy to assume that the bond has broken, that they've lost interest, that their feelings were never real. But often the truth is far more complicated. The bond doesn't break, it just gets buried under fear. Avoidants are not incapable of love or connection. They experience emotional closeness, often deeply, but their nervous system is wired to associate that closeness with risk of being overwhelmed, controlled, hurt, or even abandoned. Ironically, the very intimacy they desire is the same intimacy that activates their defense mechanisms. And when that fear kicks in, they don't communicate, they retreat from it, they disconnect, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to stay and feel safe at the same time. So what happens to the bond in that moment? It doesn't vanish. It gets pushed down, stored away, hidden beneath layers of emotional armor. On the surface, it might look like indifference, but beneath that surface, the connection is still alive. It's just entangled with anxiety, confusion, and a desperate need for control. This is why avoidants often return after disappearing, not because they're playing games, but because the feelings didn't go away. They just got buried until the emotional threat passed. And that fear, it's usually rooted in early experiences. Many avoidants were raised in environments where their emotional needs were minimized or ignored. They learned that showing vulnerability led to pain, shame, or rejection. So as adults, when someone gets close, that old programming kicks in. Closeness equals danger. Even if the person they're with is kind, respectful, and loving, their nervous system doesn't register safety, it registers pressure. That's why the bond doesn't disintegrate. It's still there. But it's hidden behind fear-based behaviors, withdrawal, silence, mixed signals, or coldness. If you're the one on the receiving end, this can feel incredibly painful. You might question your worth, your intuition, or whether the connection was ever mutual. But understanding the avoidance inner conflict helps reframe the situation. Their fear isn't proof that you did something wrong. It's proof that the bond touched a place in them they've spent years trying to protect. The tragedy is that many avoidants never unearth that buried bond unless they do the inner work to understand and confront their own fear. And many partners never get to see the depth of feeling that was always there. That's why relationships with avoidants often require both distance and clarity, space for the avoidant to feel without pressure, and strength from the partner to not chase or overfunction. So no, the bond doesn't disappear. It just gets layered under the emotional dust of fear until either growth pulls it back into the light or fear buries it permanently. Avoidantly attached individuals have a specific emotional rhythm: approach, retreat, regulate, return. This pattern isn't always conscious, but it plays out with striking consistency. One of the most confusing aspects of being involved with sumo, the avoidant, is how they can suddenly pull away, go silent, or act detached, and then just as unexpectedly reappear. To outsiders, it seems manipulative. To their partners, it feels emotionally destabilizing. But from a psychological perspective, the reason is clearer. Avoidants often reemerge once the emotional threat has passed. For avoidance, closeness triggers anxiety, not because they don't crave connection, but because they equate intimacy with emotional vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like danger. When things start to get too emotionally intense, especially if conflict, expectations, or deeper feelings arise, their internal alarm system goes off. The connection, rather than feeling secure, begins to feel suffocating. So they retreat. It's a survival instinct. Emotionally shutting down or physically distancing themselves to self-regulate. In the moment, they may genuinely feel that they need space, that they're not ready, or even that the relationship is no longer right for them. But that's often a misinterpretation of emotional overload. Their nervous system, wired from early attachment experiences, tells them the only way to feel safe is to be alone. They don't always realize that what they're running from isn't you. It's the feeling of emotional exposure they don't know how to handle. And then time passes, space settles in, you stop reaching out. The pressure dissolves. The emotional intensity that made them feel overwhelmed has now subsided. Without the closeness triggering their fear, their nervous system begins to calm. They can breathe again. And this is when something shifts. With the threat of intimacy removed, they can now reflect on the relationship with less defensiveness and more clarity. They remember the comfort, the connection, the care. They begin to miss what they pushed away. That's when they reemerge. Their return isn't necessarily manipulative. It's a regulation pattern. They come back because the emotional storm they feared has passed, and their system is now open to reconnection. The problem is, if this cycle continues without awareness or healing, it creates a push-pull dynamic that deeply wounds both people. You're left walking on eggshells, never sure when they'll retreat again. They feel safe only when distant and uncomfortable when close. Understanding this pattern is vital, not to excuse it, but to recognize what you're really dealing with. If you're consistently available while they cycle in and out, you end up doing the emotional labor for two. But when you hold your boundaries, stop chasing, and allow space for them to self-reflect, you interrupt the pattern. You signal that safety isn't found in distance, it's found in accountability and emotional maturity. Avoidants often return not because they never cared, but because they're finally calm enough to feel what they ran from. But unless they learn to stay when it's hard, the cycle will repeat. That's the real work. Learning that love doesn't have to be feared. When someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away, the natural instinct for many partners is to panic, pursue, or over-explain. The silence can feel unbearable, especially when you deeply care for them and just want resolution, clarity, or closeness again. But here's the truth that few realize. Your grounded, your calm, self-respecting stillness can be more powerful than any desperate attempt to fix the distance. In fact, it's often that emotional equilibrium that begins to trigger their return. Avoidants are hyper-attuned to emotional demands. Closeness to them can feel like pressure. Even if you're not directly asking for anything, your emotional intensity, unregulated reactions, or constant checking in can overwhelm them. When they sense that your peace depends on their presence, it creates a subconscious belief that they're responsible for your emotions, and that makes them retreat even more. They equate closeness with losing themselves, so when you lean in harder, they back out faster. But when you stay grounded, when you stop chasing, regulate your own nervous system, and honor your self-worth, they notice. Not immediate tell, perhaps, but over time, the absence of emotional pressure gives them space to feel something they rarely get to feel in relationships: safe. Safe from emotional expectations, safe from being pushed before they're ready. And that safety becomes the very condition that allows them to reconsider the connection rather than run from it. Your grounded response also mirrors a key trait that avoidants respect, even if they can't name it: emotional independence. When you don't react in chaos, when you don't spiral into neediness, you demonstrate that you are emotionally self-contained, that you are capable of sitting with discomfort without demanding someone else fix it. This is attractive to an avoidant, not because they want coldness, but because emotional self-sufficiency feels like respect, not threat. Additionally, your stance challenges their assumptions. Avoidants are often used to partners over-perfunctioning, chasing, or collapsing when they withdraw. When you don't do any of those things, it disrupts their expectations. They may begin to wonder, why didn't you chase me? Why are you so calm? Have you moved on? And in that curiosity, a door opens. Because now they're no longer protecting themselves from you, they're drawn toward the mystery of your strength. But grounded doesn't mean passive. It doesn't mean waiting endlessly or suppressing your needs. It means responding instead of reacting. It means letting them feel the weight of their distance while you stay rooted in your own value. You don't beg for connection, you embody it. Ironically, the moment you stop trying to pull them back is often the moment they begin to return. Not because you manipulated them, but because your presence, strong, calm, and centered, even in absence, reminded them of what they couldn't see when they were overwhelmed. That's not just attractive, it's transformative.